to take a slightly different tack in this debate. I would like to talk about Joseph Ephraim Caro. Joseph Caro was a very distinguished scholar who was born in 1488, and his family was expelled from Toledo in Spain by Ferdinand II and Isabella I as a result of the Alhambra decree. Most of the family died on their travels across the Mediterranean. Rabbi Joseph Caro, as he became later on, survived. He actually ended up writing one of the most important books of Jewish literature, the Shulchan Aruch, which is still regarded as the definitive definitive description of Jewish law. And it is a model, of course, amongst other things, of moral attitudes to other people, which is one of the issues that it discusses. Joseph Caro went from, after Portugal, we lose exactly where he went, but he ended up, after Turkey, in Greece briefly, and finally went to Israel, which is where he intended to go all the time, landing in a place called Sfat, now called Sfat, actually spelt Safed, in the north of Israel. And there he established a synagogue, which I've visited. His tombstone is there, and my family, I think, are the 21st generation of his direct descendants. My family came to this country in 1680, and I regard myself as totally British in every way, respecting British values in absolute terms, delighted to be here rather than anywhere else. But I'm also, my lords, a Zionist. And one of the reasons, of course, is because Caro lived in Sfat, and having visited there first time in 1958, when at that time Israel was the most liberal democracy anywhere in that part of the world at all, extraordinary socialist democracy which believed altruistically in the rights of all people to live. I was very surprised to hear, incidentally, the Right Reverend Prelate argue the status of Christians in Israel, because after all, in Israel, Christians are protected like in no other way in any part of the Middle East. So that was a shock for me that he felt in the way that he did. But having said that, let me just say that when I went in 58, and I've been many, many times since, I saw that extraordinary gradual erosion of those principles as the reality of constant threat ground Israel down and threatened it more and more, until, of course, it started with the Fedayeen. Now, if you go to Sfat now, Sfat is a walk from the Syrian border about 6 miles. Actually, it's a walk, and indeed, we know what's happening on the other side of that border. To the north, about 10 miles away, is Lebanon, where we know that there are child soldiers, which we've seen photographs of only in the press this week, in the British press, carrying automatic weapons and machine guns. And, of course, one understands absolutely the horrible situation of the Palestinian people. Nobody could possibly tolerate what has happened to them. Nobody can do anything other than despair at their plight and their despair and the shock that they have. But one has to say that the problem, it seems to me, is rather well expressed by the situation in that town of Sfat, where at the time when Caro lived, there were around 14,000 Jews. We know that from, incidentally, a Syrian who visited him, one Yahya al-Garhiri, who actually wrote a very interesting essay about Sfat. But a state has a duty to protect its citizens, and the problem, of course, is that if you see people being beheaded on the border across the way, and if you see absolute anarchy in all the states surrounding you, and if you see the kind of language which the noble Lord Mitchell has referred to from the people who are in charge at the current time in Gaza, which of course Israel evacuated. The problem, of course, is that the Israeli government, wrong though I think it is, continues to dig its heels in. And so I think we cannot possibly, as the noble Lord Davis said, give way to the idea of recognizing the Palestinian state as a state at this stage, because I believe very strongly that this would actually make the situation worse. It would actually justify the continuation of the kind of threats that we know. There are a few people in this chamber, I think, who don't read Arabic. I know that the noble Lord Green of Beddington does. Well, if you read Arabic, you will see that ever since 1948, 6- and 7-year-olds have been subjected to the worst kind of anti-Semitism in their schools, the writings that they have, far worse than anything that the Nazis put out at the time of Auschwitz. And I think we have to say that that really is a very serious problem. There is hope. Last month, or a few months ago, I went to a wedding in an Arab village in Israel, and there the Arab host was hosting a strictly Jewish wedding, a kosher wedding, and he had a partnership with a kosher caterer to make certain that his guests loved what they saw. And it was a terrible tragedy for him, because you may remember that in the Middle East last January there was a massive snowstorm, and the reason why the bride had chosen that Arab village, not because it was a totally safe, wonderful place, one felt completely at ease looking over the hills, but at one moment all his vines were destroyed in the snow. And of course the fact was that he then went out and replanted them because he wanted to try to satisfy that Jewish bride. My lords, there is hope in Israel. We have to try to nurture that hope, but I don't believe we can do it by strengthening what are already the resolutions which are going to gear to violence.
Friend.